Hi, it's Mr. C here again, and we're going to do another guided reading from the Read at Home series. This one's called The Hairy Scary Monster. It's level 5A. So for our guided reading, we're going to be doing it in 4 different ways. Remember the picture walk first, then the read aloud, then the echo read, and then a chance for you to read independently. Remember, you can stop this video, pause this video to take longer on any pages that you need to. All right, let's get started. Okay, let's get started with the Read at Home book, The Hairy Scary Monster. Remember, we're just going to do a picture walk only. Talk about the pictures. Try and see if you can figure out as much detail as you can that's happening. Don't worry about the words yet through this time. So, title of this book is The Hairy Scary Monster. Take a look at the front cover. What do you think the story might be about? And let's start with page 1. What's happening here? What's happening in this page? What's happening here now? Who's in the bed with him? What's happening here? Now what is the boy doing? What's happening, do you think, in the story? What is Floppy the dog thinking? Who's this? What do you think the boy is trying to tell them? What's happening in this picture? Now what's happening? What's happening here? What do you think Dad's going to do with Floppy? What's this boy thinking? What's going on? Where is he looking? What's happening in this page? What's happening now? What's the boy doing? Who's running into the room? Why? What's going on in this page? Take a look at this big double page picture. What's Floppy thinking? Where's the mom looking? What's happened? What's the mom doing here? What's happening to the boy now? What else do you see in the room? What's happening in the dark? Now what's happening? What is the boy doing? Who's running into the room? How's the boy feeling? What do you think he's pointing to? Why are they pointing to Floppy? How's the boy feeling now? What do you think happened in this picture? Now that you've had a chance to look through the book and just do a picture walk and talk about what you see in the pictures, that helps you give a better understanding of what might have happened in the story. Let's also see if we can answer some questions just based off of the pictures. You can always go back and look at these questions again. Here they are. Why didn't Kipper want to go to sleep? Why do you think he didn't want to go to sleep? Which 3 places did Kipper say the monster was hiding? What things made you laugh in the story? What makes you scared? Okay, we're going to go through the book again, this time as a read aloud, where Mr. C's reading it to you, and I've got my trusty yellow highlighter. Let's start. The hairy, scary monster. Kipper didn't want to go to sleep. Biff and Chip are at Gran's, he said. I don't like being on my own. Poor Kipper, thought Floppy. I'll stay with him. Oh no, Floppy, said Mom. Kipper is going to sleep. But Kipper wasn't going to sleep. He was wide awake. I can't go to sleep, he grumbled. I just can't. Kipper laughed. I know. I'll play a trick, he said. I'll trick Dad and get him to come upstairs. He jumped up and down on his bed. Dad, he yelled, there's a hairy, scary monster. It's coming to get me. Dad, help! Dad ran up to Kipper's bedroom. Floppy barked and ran after him. What monster? Said Dad. Where is it? Kipper pointed to the curtains. It's behind the curtains, he said. It's got sharp yellow teeth and a glowing red eyes. Dad looked behind the curtains, but he didn't see a monster. There's no monster here, he said. Look. It was a trick, laughed Kipper. It was just a trick. Dad laughed and tucked Kipper up. Be a good boy and go to sleep, he said, and no more tricks. Floppy was hiding. He didn't like monsters. Come out, Floppy, said Dad. Kipper is going to sleep. But Kipper wasn't going to sleep. He was still wide awake. I don't like being on my own, he grumbled. It's boring. Kipper laughed. I know. I'll play another trick, he said. I'll trick Mom and get her to come upstairs. Mom, yelled Kipper. There's a hairy, scary monster. It's going to eat me up. Mom, help! Mom ran up to Kipper's bedroom. Floppy barked and ran after her. What monster? Said Mom. Where is it? Kipper pointed to the wardrobe. It's in the wardrobe, he said. It's got long, sharp claws and hairy jaws. Mom looked in the wardrobe, but she didn't see a monster. There's no monster here, she said. Look. It was a trick, laughed Kipper. It was just a trick. Mom tucked Kipper up again. Be a good boy and go to sleep, she said, and no more tricks. Kipper began to fall asleep. His eyes were just closing when he heard something under the bed. It was something that was snuffling. It was something that was snorting. It was something that was hairy and very, very scary. Snuffle, snort. Help! Yelled Kipper. There's really is a monster. Mom, Dad, help me. I'm scared. Mom and Dad ran upstairs. What's wrong, Kipper? They said. There's a monster, he sobbed. There's a monster under the bed. Dad looked under the bed. There is a monster, he said. It's the hairy, scary, floppy monster. Okay, we're going to go through the story a third time. This time it's an echo read. Remember, that's where Mr. C reads the sentence first, and then you get a chance to read. If it's a long sentence, I might break it up into a couple of pieces. All right, let's get started. So, Mr. C's turn first. The hairy, scary monster. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. Kipper didn't want to go to sleep. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. Biff and Chip are at Gran's, he said. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. I don't like being on my own. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. Poor Kipper, thought Floppy. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. I'll stay with him. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. Oh no, Floppy, said Mom. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. Kipper is going to sleep. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. But Kipper wasn't going to sleep. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. He was wide awake. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. I can't go to sleep, he grumbled. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. I just can't. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. Kipper laughed. I know, I'll play a trick, he said. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. I'll trick Dad and get him to come upstairs. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. He jumped up and down on his bed. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. Dad! He yelled. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. There's a hairy, scary monster. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. It's coming to get me, Dad. Help! Your turn. Mr. C's turn. Dad ran up to Kipper's bedroom. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. Floppy barked and ran after him. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. What monster? Said Dad. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. Where is it? Your turn. Mr. C's turn. Kipper pointed to the curtains. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. It's behind the curtains, he said. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. It's got sharp yellow teeth and glowing red eyes. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. Dad looked behind the curtains, but he didn't see a monster. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. There's no monster here, he said. Look. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. It was a trick, laughed Kipper. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. It was just a trick. Your turn. Follow the words as my finger points to them. Here we go. Mr. C's turn. Dad laughed and tucked Kipper up. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. Be a good boy and go to sleep, he said. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. And no more tricks. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. Floppy was hiding. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. He didn't like monsters. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. Come out, Floppy, said Dad. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. Kipper is going to sleep. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. But Kipper wasn't going to sleep. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. He was still wide awake. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. I don't like being on my own, he grumbled. It's boring. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. Kipper laughed. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. I know. I'll play another trick, he said. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. I'll trick Mum and get her to come upstairs. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. Mom, yelled Kipper. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. There's a hairy, scary monster. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. It's going to eat me up. Mom, help. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. Mum ran up to Kipper's bedroom. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. Floppy barked and ran after her. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. What monster? Said Mum. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. Where is it? Your turn. Mr. C's turn. Kipper pointed to the wardrobe. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. It's in the wardrobe, he said. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. It's got long, sharp claws and hairy jaws. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. Mum looked in the wardrobe, but she didn't see a monster. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. There's no monster here, she said. Look. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. It was a trick, laughed Kipper. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. It was just a trick. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. Mum tucked Kipper up again. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. Be a good boy and go to sleep, she said. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. And no more tricks. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. Kipper began to fall asleep. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. His eyes were just closing. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. When he heard something under the bed. Your turn. Let's do that sentence again. It's a long one. Mr. C's turn. His eyes were just closing when he heard something under the bed. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. It was something that was snuffling. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. It was something that was snorting. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. It was something that was hairy and very, very scary. Your turn. Snuffle. Snort. Mr. C's turn. Help! Yelled Kipper. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. There really is a monster. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. Mom, Dad, help me. I'm scared. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. Mom and Dad ran upstairs. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. What's wrong, Kipper? They said. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. There's a monster, he sobbed. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. There's a monster under the bed. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. Dad looked under the bed. Your turn. Mr. C's turn. There is a monster, he said. Your turn. And Mr. C's turn. It's the hairy, scary, floppy monster. And your turn. So now you know the story better, you might be able to answer these questions a little easier. Why didn't Kipper want to go to sleep? Which 3 places did Kipper say the monster was hiding? What things made you laugh in the story? What makes you scared? Okay, one more last time through the book. This time is what we call an independent read. I'll point to the words, but it's up to you to read them. Remember, you can pause these pages to have longer on a page. You can rewind to do it again. And you should practice this story over and over and over and over again until you can read through the whole story with making no mistakes, where you don't need any help at all, and when your reading voice is reading at the same speed that you would be talking at. That's what we call a fluent reader, and that's what we call mastering the story. All right, time for you to give it a try. Start with the title. Remember, repeat this video over and over so that you can continue to practice that, especially the last part where you're independent reading. You want to be able to read it very quickly, with no mistakes, no need for help, and so that your voice is reading at the same speed that you would talk at. See if you can read as fast as my finger moves across the page on each word. All right, good job.